My name is Alan Reed. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network, and I welcome you all today for a terrific conversation on IP and branding strategy for COVID and beyond, protected on all sides, produced in partnership with our good friends at McDonald Hopkins. And we'll dive in just a moment. We have a few commercial messages we want to get through, and then we will dive right into the panel. For those of you that that have been following along with us, we've been putting on 8 to 10 virtual events per month since COVID started back in March. It's been an exciting way to keep industry together, connected, talking about the important issues that we are all facing and the incredibly quick changing business environment. So all exciting stuff, and we're glad you followed along with us. For those of you who are less familiar with the Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network, we are a 3.5-year-old mission-driven industry organization. We bring together the 4,500 food and beverage companies that call the greater Chicagoland area home, and leverage their incredible power to do great things, grow the industry, grow the local economy, create jobs, and those are incredibly important every day, but especially important in the midst of and in the aftermath of the global pandemic we're currently living through. We try hard not to dwell on COVID, but we tend to find our discussions almost always circle around a little bit. So a bit of a challenge for us, but so many of the principles that we talk about apply in the midst of COVID as well as post-COVID as well. Also, we have a sister organization called Bigger Table. Bigger Table brings together that same food and beverage industry of the greater Chicagoland area to collaborate on charitable and economic growth initiatives that give back to the greater Chicagoland area. We just recently, sort of in the middle of August, donated 250,000 servings of healthy food to area food banks. Every single bit of packaging, manufacturing, all of the ingredients, all of the know-how, all of the labeling, all of the everything that went into that product was donated, and again, to benefit those facing food insecurity and support our incredible local food banks and food pantries. And really, again, want to thank McDonald Hopkins for pushing forward this incredibly important topic. So much going on in terms of branding and intellectual property in the midst of COVID, and such a great topic to dig in on today. So thank you to McDonald Hopkins for bringing the issue to our attention, and really sort of spearheading the effort to make sure we're talking about it as a group and as an industry today. We have an incredible panel, and I'm going to turn it over to them, although I'll be moderating throughout, but we have an incredible panel today. And in fact, let's go ahead and start with those introductions. So just for each of our panelists today, please just introduce yourself, your role, your company, the perspective you bring to the conversation. Let's start with you, Erin.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you to the Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network for having me here today and for bringing together this panel to talk about intellectual property issues facing the food and beverage industry in these times. I'm an attorney at McDonald Hopkins here in Chicago, and I would consider myself to be an IP, an intellectual property jack of all trades, helping companies with really whatever IP issues come up in the course of their business. When I decided to make the switch from engineering to practicing law many years ago, it was because I was really passionate about innovation, but I didn't necessarily want to be the one in the lab tinkering every day. But one of really the best parts about my job is that I get to work closely with business owners, with inventors, with innovators to understand their brand, to understand what they're doing with their business, what they're creating, and to develop and implement really functional and meaningful policies and practices for protecting their rights through patents and trademarks, copyrights, and even trade secrets. And in addition to that, I make sure that my clients are well set up when they are bringing a new product to market, making sure that they're not going to step on anyone else's IP when they launch. And sort of at the other end of the spectrum, I assist companies in enforcing their IP, finding value in their IP by licensing. And I think that that's something that's really important in today's market. I joined McDonald Hopkins about almost a year ago, and it was really for the opportunity to work with some very talented attorneys. There's about 140 across several offices at our firm, and they practice in over 50 different areas and industry groups. So it really provides a great opportunity for us to provide comprehensive business-focused service to our clients. We're not looking at issues in a vacuum. We're actually looking holistically at their business to understand what's going on and to set them up well for whatever issues come up. And I find that, if you can turn to the next slide, to be really important, particularly for those in the food and beverage industry, because it's not just FDA regulatory issues or advertising issues that come up for those in the industry. It's tax, it's employee issues, there's franchising, finance, and intellectual property. And with my talented colleagues, I'm able to provide really end-to-end coverage for our clients in all of those different areas of law. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Erin. Sabrina, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yes, my name is Sabrina Hudson. I'm one of the in-house attorneys at the Kraft Heinz Company. I've been with the company and Legacy Heinz for 14 years. And my responsibilities right now include, I'm responsible for the company's global intellectual property matters. And I'm very grateful to be here today, and thank you everybody for inviting me, and look forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thanks, Sabrina. And Ryan, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here today. So I'm Ryan Zurich. I am the managing director and head of the advisory practice at Ocean Tomo. The advisory group at Ocean Tomo, we manage all the investment banking activities across the firm. So we help clients conduct transactions around IP, whether that's patent related, brand or trademark related, and also raise capital around those objectives. So when companies come to us, they're looking to monetize IP in a broader sense. We also have a broker dealer at the firm. So just like a Goldman Sachs is structured with a broker dealer and an investment bank, we are too, and our niche focus is on IP. We've spent quite a bit of time in the brand and trademark space recently. A lot of our focus has been on helping clients navigate through the current COVID environment, whether that's to raise capital or deal with issues to bring cash into the company and how to leverage their IP assets to do so. So whether that's transacting patents or leveraging the brand to as collateral for a loan, for example, to secure that capital or reduce the cost of the capital. We've spent a lot of time in that space as well. And a number of my colleagues in our valuation practice at the firm have been focused quite heavily on helping both funders, institutional capital understand the value of brands, as well as our corporate clients understand the value of their brands for both sides of that transaction.
Terrific. Thanks, Ryan. And last but not least, Dennis Ryan from Beta Rudder.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Dennis Ryan. I'm the Executive Creative Director at Beta Rudder, and I basically spent my entire advertising career selling and introducing food and beverage brands for everyone from Quaker to ConAgra to Kraft Heinz to Unilever, Anheuser-Busch, Miller. If it comes in a bottle, a box, or a package and it involves food or beverage, I probably come close to it. So make stuff up.
Terrific, terrific. Welcome to you all. So just a couple of housekeeping things and then we'll dive right in. Please, everyone, make sure you're somewhat close to your laptop just to make sure that we can absolutely hear you. And then for our attendees, please use the chat and Q&A features. Just, you can make comments, you can put in questions. We really want to interact with you. We promise we'll get back to the questions before we, or we'll do our best to get to all the questions at the end. So you don't have to remember anything. You can just type it in there and we'll respond back. For those attending via LinkedIn Live, just put your comments right into the chat box. And through the magic of Brianna's hard work, she'll bring them here into the conversation, and we can interact that way. So away we go. So let's dig right in and talk about, like, what have we learned or are we learning about branding and intellectual property in the midst of COVID-19? Let's start with Erin.
Sure. So I think always, and particularly now, having a well-protected brand, formulation, recipe, packaging, what have you, is really important. And, you know, while you can certainly carve out your space by having a superior product or by having a big marketing budget, IP is really going to be the best way and really the only way for you down the road as a company to be able to keep competitors from entering your space and from using what you've spent all of your time and energy and money building. So IP is really a way for you to put a fence up around your assets. And that fence is what you can use to keep competitors out. And sometimes really all you need is that patent number, that registered symbol next to your trademark to show others that you've protected those assets. But sometimes, and it may seem aggressive, you might have to turn to approaching your competitors about licensing and perhaps even turning to litigation in order to enforce that IP. You know, having a trademark or a patent on your shelf collecting dust isn't necessarily going to be adding value to your company. And I think nowadays, finding value in things like your IP is really going to be important for keeping your company competitive when things are getting really, really tight for a lot of food and beverage companies.
Terrific, thank you. Sabrina, what is Kraft Heinz learning in the midst of all of this craziness?
Yeah, I think, and hopefully everybody can hear me, but if not, let me know. But basically, I think, you know, there's a couple of things we see happening. I think most people are seeing this in the food and beverage industry is, you know, when COVID hit, there was, you know, a lot of consumers went to brands that they, you know, that they grew up with and that they knew. And in fact, some consumers who had never even tried these brands went to brands that, you know, had been around for a long time. They got comfort with that brand. And I think that's because that brand had such equity built in. And I think, you know, those brands, you know, were able to not only leverage that, but they were able to leverage new consumers. And so I think, you know, that's the key. Even the older brands who are now, you know, getting into the kitchens of new consumers, you know, how do they stay relevant to those consumers as the pandemic continues and hopefully someday ends? And then I think, you know, the emerging brands who may not have been maybe top of mind, you know, during the COVID pandemic at first, also needs to, you know, how can they stay relevant? What do they bring to the table? And I think, you know, as long as the brands are educating consumers on why you should choose our brand, I think that's the key point, both from an emerging brand perspective and a brand that's been in existence for a while.
Sorry, I hate when I do that. Dennis, what are we learning sort of from, I'll say from a advertising and promotion perspective during this?
I think what's interesting is we talk about this resurgence of consumer packaged goods brands and these familiar brands, as Sabrina just brought up. But one of the other things, people are spending more time preparing meals in the home. Again, there's a renewed focus. But the thing I've noticed, and the thing I believe, and I think it's been a trend that's only accelerated with COVID, is that IP is really, it was always, oh, taste and convenience. Look how tasty we are. Look how convenient we are. We've got this ingredient. In a commoditized market, those things can be copied very quickly. The thing we've been noticing among trends is when you talk about product innovation today in IP, there are actually changes to the supply chain. What's interesting is how sustainable are you? How do you treat workers? What's your carbon footprint? These once esoteric storylines are now looked at as product innovations and product improvements, and it's IP. So what's interesting to me is just seeing where the story begins for food brands to create lasting differentiation and drive consumer loyalty with millennials and Gen Z. That seems to be the new frontier, and it's only accelerated as we've paid more attention to food brands with COVID.
Interesting. I think that's a really great point. Ryan, in terms of IP value, what are you seeing changing this year?
I think what we're seeing is, frankly, a lot of companies, and in food and beverage as well, in particular, turning to this as an asset class that can be leveraged for an ability to raise capital. There's been a need to bring capital into the company. It's we're in a distressed environment right now. And a lot of companies are coming to us because assets that historically had been untapped or sort of on the blacklist for leveraging as part of a loan are now being allowed to be used in that collateral package to unlock the cash that's needed to get through this macro climate. And so that's number one. From a valuation perspective, I think companies who are financially healthy are also turning to this asset class to see, okay, what can we do to leverage this to maybe reduce our cost of capital or to raise more capital to expand and perhaps take advantage of a market opportunity to gain more market share where others might be struggling, unfortunately. And so we're seeing a lot of opportunity to use brands in the financial markets to either continue to grow a business or solve a problem. And so we've had a multitude of phone calls from many companies across industry sectors looking to do that, to accomplish those goals. And then, the last thing I'll say is just, reverting back to the valuation point. I think a lot of companies for different purposes look to leverage their IP or want to understand its value, maybe for future planning purposes. So maybe right now isn't the right time. Maybe there's not a transaction to be had today, but companies are thinking, okay, maybe I need to be a little bit more proactive in managing my IP portfolio, whether that's on the brand or trademark side or on the patent side, to think about what's coming next, maybe what's going to happen in 2021 or 2022, perhaps a future M&A transaction that we might be looking for, or might be looking to acquire another business in our space. And so I think people are giving more thought to this asset that's maybe sat on the shelf for a little while because the macro climate has just necessitated it.
Makes perfect sense. So we've all sort of touched on it, but I want to sort of just dig in on why is now particularly important to have, I'll say, an IP strategy as well as sort of protections around your intellectual property. Why is that more important in the midst of COVID? Erin, let's start with you.
Sure. So, maybe from the big brand perspective, I think, as many of us have mentioned, there is a struggle for some to find value, to find capital in their companies. And I think, many of them have had the pleasure of having big budgets to protect their IP, protect their trademarks and any of their innovations and patents. And I think now is the time to really take a critical look at those IP portfolios that you have. IP strategy should not be static. You should be constantly evaluating what you have in your back pocket and looking at all of that IP to see if there are ways to monetize them, whether that be through licensing others or should it come to that, potentially going after those that are copying your brand or that are encroaching on your space. Big brands, they are also big targets. They have very high profile. They've put a lot of effort into raising awareness for all of their different various products and brands. So there can be those out there that are looking to ride on the coattails of that success, to ride on the coattails of, you know, the what those companies have built. So I think for the big brands to be aware of what IP they have and consider options for monetizing that IP. And for the emerging brands, I think laying the foundation for what plans and goals you have for your company in IP is critical at these early stages. And I get it, there's not a lot of money often for, you know, going through a lot of these different IP options. You know, patents can be, they can be expensive, but there are, you know, there are options in trade secrets. If there's some method of manufacturing, method of processing that you've developed that can be kept secret, there are ways that and policies that you should implement to keep that a secret, to protect those assets. And again, for the emerging brands, the brand names that you built, the brand ethos that you built is really one of your number one assets in the beginning. So set aside some of your budget for trademarking those assets, because you know, should one of your goals be to get picked up by a big brand or potentially to need a loan or financing, your IP portfolio is absolutely going to be one of the first things that are considered in those types of deals.
Terrific, thanks. Sabrina, do you have thoughts on sort of big brand versus emerging brand and how to best leverage IP?
Well, I think, you know, Kraft Heinz is a well-known company, but we have both. We have big brands and we have emerging brands. So, you know, I get the benefit of getting to see each one. And I think, you know, I 100% agree with Erin. I think regardless of whether you're a big, historic, you know, well-known brand, you've been around for a while, or you're more of a newer emerging brand, I think your IP strategy, you know, it needs to be at the forefront. It doesn't, you have to constantly, you know, as you're developing, you need to think about your IP, but you also need to think about it, you know, as you continue on and protecting it. And, you know, really it's in this time right now, not just COVID, but with everything else we have going on in the US, I think we need a way, companies need a way to grab the attention of consumers and we need a way to help them cope with the things that they're coping with and bring joy to their lives. And I think, you know, food and beverage is one way you can bring joy to people's lives. So you have to use your IP to, you know, gain attention. Do you have a great recipe that, you know, meets that provides great taste to consumers? If so, you need to protect that recipe as a trade secret, as Erin said. You know, do you have a process that no one else can use? Or to Dennis's point, do you have a story to tell about, you know, something unique about your product, whether it's sustainability or, you know, sourcing and things like that? And you can use your IP to protect those areas and also to get your message out to consumers, because whether you're an existing brand or a new brand, if consumers don't know about you and they don't know why they should buy your product, they're not going to buy it.
Absolutely. And in fact, Dennis, I'd like to dig in on that a little bit. In terms of getting noticed and getting traction, which are so important for all brands, big and small. How has that changed this year, and how do we think that's going to change kind of going forward?
You know, I think it's just become thrown into higher relief. It's always been there. How do you get almost any food or beverage brand can be commoditized quickly? So how do you keep lasting loyalty with your brand, and how do you avoid that whole, hey, get the most for the least kind of race to the bottom of, you know, margin disintegration? And really it comes to telling good stories. And I think what's interesting, and Sabrina touched on this, the disquiet in the marketplace right now and the kind of whistling and screaming and all these different things doesn't really serve brands. It creates this immense distraction, this immense anxiety. And I believe brands can actually be harbingers of comfort and familiarity and things that reaffirm some basic values. It doesn't matter where you are, that, yeah, I like that. I like people being nice to people. I like people taking care of things. I like stewardship and ownership. So again, just keep beating our point of view pretty hard. I do believe the investments you make in supply chain really do are the equivalent of product improvements. You can add 10% more vitamin C, or you can add, 10% reduction in carbon emissions. Well, people might be able to copy the vitamin C. They're not going to be as quick copying your sustainability efforts in those kind of investments there, so they can provide better long-term loyalty. And with everyone having this story right at the end of their hand in their smartphone, and the fact that Gen Z and millennials do check their smartphones when they're in stores and stuff, you have a great chance to create online backstories that matter and resonate. And that's the way I believe, in a one-to-one way, to drive brands into greater loyalty today.
Terrific. I love what you're saying, that we often think about branding, or we think about sort of a patent when we think about intellectual property, but it really does extend to packaging design, kind of the technology itself, the ethos, the claims, the supply chain. I'd love to hear sort of everybody chime in on sort of, so how do you protect your supply chain, or how do you protect and how do we use all of the I'll say just all of the elements of intellectual property to really build that wall of protection that, Aaron, you talked about earlier, especially in the midst of so many things changing so quickly. And again, supply chain, and maybe your sourcing is a competitive advantage for you. How does that all work? Let's start with Aaron. And actually, Ryan's unmuting, so maybe we should let Ryan chime in and then go to Aaron.
Well, sure. I mean, the comment I would make on this point is really just to have an international patent strategy or an international brand strategy. I think it's important, if you're thinking about your supply chain, your large global brand, whether you're dealing with emerging brands or established brands, to have a fully established strategy in the key markets that matter, whether that's the Asian markets or the European markets or the South American markets. It's really important to think holistically about that strategy. And a question actually came in about, from an international perspective, how is the current political climate creating a murkiness for U.S. companies? I think there's a lot of arrows in the quiver of U.S. companies to fight back against infringement, whether that's patent related or brand related or trade secret related. There's a lot of arrows in the quiver. There's good strategies that can be had in Europe, particularly in Germany or the UK courts, for getting injunctions established. There's the ITC here in the United States that can help prohibit those products from coming into the market. You can get exclusion orders issued against those products. I think it's important to have a holistic strategy and not just think about having that protection, but having that protection worldwide if you are a global brand. In terms of the political environment, I'll just give one anecdote. In China on Friday, there was a ruling against a number of U.S. and foreign institutions that were seeking to enforce actions in China against non-Chinese companies, some against Chinese companies. And I think that's just part of the overall geopolitical climate that we're in, fighting a trade war, and that was kind of retribution for that. In fact, one of those companies that lost in China was actually a Spanish firm, and so it's not just affecting U.S. companies; it's affecting European companies as well. So I think it's all part of a greater trade war. It's all part of a greater geopolitical climate. But for U.S. companies in particular, it's important to have that global strategy and have that global strategy in the markets that matter from an IP perspective around the world, which we know to be Europe and Germany. We know to be, the big Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, and China. And so I think it's important to think holistically as you're planning or thinking about what you can do to either plan for the future of your IP portfolio, whether that's brands or trademarks, or, what can you do to augment your existing portfolio?
Terrific. Thanks for addressing that. Aaron, anything to add to that?
Absolutely. I totally agree that having a holistic approach to your IP protection is critical, and protecting some of these atypical, I guess, aspects of your brand and of your your message and your ethos for your company is absolutely possible. You know, I do think that there can be a bit of a tug of war, particularly in this industry where a lot of companies are pushing for greater transparency in their supply chains, pushing for transparency in their sourcing. But if you have found a really key source of a particular ingredient, or you know, something in your supply chain is of great value to you, you can protect that as a trade secret. If you're able to keep your suppliers and those in your network secret, and you think that that adds value to your brand and to your company, then you can put measures into place to protect that secrecy and protect it as a trade secret. So I think being creative is really important nowadays, and thinking about protecting sort of all of the different aspects that maybe are not quite as traditional as had been in the past.
I would echo one comment that Aaron, you just made it. I think I agree 100%. I think the other thing that's important is to think about how within a supply chain you can leverage technology to your advantage. So not just protecting the brand, but protecting, you know, all aspects of the supply chain, whether that's retail analytics or whether that's food packaging. There's been a lot of technology advancements over the last, I'd say, just 2 to 3. You know, go back 5 years in the space, particularly with shipping, particularly in an Amazon environment, about how to get products from across an ocean here, you know, without being perishable. There's been a lot of technology advancements. Amazon spends an enormous amount of money on trying to figure out and solve those problems. I know a lot of other companies do too. And so I think it's important to not just think in-house about how you can affect your own strategy, but think about the market landscape around you. And what's happening with you and your competitors, so that, you know, you can maintain that competitive advantage from not just a product perspective, but from a technology perspective as well.
You know, building on what Ryan just said, we're seeing so much VC funding in food and ag startups. It's very aggressive, and the amount of money getting pumped into basically these startup companies looking to apply new technology to existing problems. And I'm trying to think of the name, and of course it escapes me. There's a baby food brand now that is patenting the strains of squash and things like that they're putting into their better flavors. So they're creating their own strains and hybrids of plants for their food, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Talk about meaningful differentiation, and there's incredibly valuable IP that tells a wonderful story.
Sabrina, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think just back to Ryan's initial point, I think, you know, some people who are starting out that may be attending this call, I think it may be a little daunting for them if you think about, you know, the cost to look at a worldwide, you know, IP strategy. But I still would, you know, talk to your advisors, your legal counsel if you have them, and do look at, you know, the best that you can based on the budget you have to try to figure out, you know, at least in the next 5 years, what are your plans? Where are you planning to go? You know, are you going to be a brand that might go into Latin America or into Canada, given the borders that we share here in the U.S.? And then maybe there, you know, you can do some scanning type searches internationally and do some protection internationally, because I do agree, you know, if you ever do want to expand internationally, you know, the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of money in the US building a brand, building an equity that people know all around the world, but then you try to go into a country and somebody else already has something that prevents you from using that brand there, or someone hears about how successful you are in the US and, you know, files the same exact trademark application in a foreign country before you have the chance to do so. So I know it seems daunting at first, but I would, you know, do the best you can with whatever budget you have, and continue, as Ryan said, you know, continue to always look at your global strategy, because it will change, you know, as you continue to develop your brand and your business.
Terrific. Thank you. And we've touched on, and I want to dig a little deeper on, are there sort of new opportunities for licensing and working with co-packers now versus previously, and watch outs for that. Aaron, let's start let's start with you.
Sure. I think that partnerships and other relationships with those in the industry are going to become more and more relevant and happen more frequently. I've seen some great partnerships already happening between different brands. But as you mentioned, even with co-packers and manufacturers, media firms, advertising firms, you have to take a good look at your IP strategy in those situations as well. There will likely be agreements between your company and your partners, and make sure that you've thought about, if there's any IP that's likely going to be developed as part of that relationship, and include language in your agreements that deals with who's going to own that IP when the relationship ends.
Makes sense. Sabrina, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would echo that, especially when you're working with external manufacturers. I know a lot of people do that, whether they're, an existing brand or, a new brand. And you want to, as Aaron said, if you don't establish, while you're negotiating the terms, who's going to own what, it can get a little sticky later down the line, just like with any contract you have. It's always great when everyone is smiling, but then, down the line when things go rough or people want to part separate ways, that's when things get sticky. So make sure, that you have something in writing, not just a handshake, that who owns what, whether it's the manufacturing process, whether it's the recipe, so that, when you do, or if you ever do part ways with this external manufacturer, you can continue to leverage the product you have. And on licensing, I think licensing should always be a consideration, regardless of, the stage of your brand. It can build brand equity and, be in the minds of consumers in areas that you may not have the capability for, or, you may not, have the manufacturing abilities. And so always think about that. Is there a licensing opportunity? And from a legal perspective, when you do enter into a license agreement, the main thing is to monitor what the licensee is doing, making sure that they are, monitoring the quality of their products, the quality and look and feel of their packaging and their advertising, to make sure that they're staying on your brand, staying in line with what message you're conveying. As Dennis pointed out earlier, different brands can have unique messages, but if you grant a licensee a license and they have a different message on that same topic, it's going to turn out badly for you, even though you're out there building equity. You may be building something you don't want to build.
One thing I'll just tack on to that exact thought is, if you are engaging sponsors or influencers, you have to be very aware of your agreements with those parties as well, because you have to ensure that they are using your trademark, using your brand in the way that you want it to be used, because you don't want them to damage your brand equity or to damage the actual value of your trademark, whether that be through diluting it or maybe using it in a generic way. So influencers are huge for a lot of brands nowadays. So make sure that your IP is being treated upfront in those agreements as well.
Great advice. My favorite sort of brand extension that I've seen happening during COVID is the Kind brand, which actually, it's this little sort of like funky, healthy, and suddenly there's like Kind cereal, and there's Kind, they're not ice cream, they're like almond milk ice, sort of like ice cream. And all of a sudden I'm like, I'm pretty sure they're using a co-packer for all of that, but they've done such a nice job sort of leaning into where the brand is. The brand is so strong. And again, this is not so long ago that was an incredible startup brand. And now, again, I'm guessing they're licensing into a bunch of interesting new areas. Anybody else have sort of a favorite brand they're watching extend? No one? I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't prep you for these questions, right?
Well, Alan, a favorite brand, but they actually have their own manufacturing, so they're not co-branding. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is Sara Lee Frozen Bakery came out with those mini cheesecakes, and they've been a massive marketplace success. And again, when you have people eating more at home and things like that, you give me a 10-inch cheesecake, and my blood sugar will be elevated for the next 3 weeks. But boy, one of those little mini ones, there you go. And so your IP there is a product form and a different innovation there. And that's again, like packaging, product forms, there's some interesting new opportunities. And to be perfectly candid, this has been quite an eye-opening seminar for a couple of reasons, not the least of which as a creative in advertising, selling food for a long time, I never really stopped and thought about IP and defining IP. And it's a brilliant way to consider differentiation and how can you protect a brand over the long term.
Terrific, terrific. Any favorite brands, any other places where you're seeing interesting extension happen? All right, again, that was a bonus question I was surprising you all with. So I'd like to think about sort of silver linings to COVID. It's easy to be sort of depressed and think, oh, the world's changing, and be really negative about it. But when I scratch the surface on that, many people are learning new things and finding new ways to do business, and there's actually some silver linings to COVID. So I'd love to hear from you all where you're seeing some silver linings happening. I mean, especially related to branding and intellectual property.
I guess I can comment on that from a finance perspective. I mean, yes, there's the distressed aspect to COVID as well, which is creating a lot of transactions in that part of this market. But there's also an opportunity. There's an opportunity because a lot of the funders, whether they're venture or established private equity firms, have a lot of dry powder to deploy in today's marketplace. If they've been heavy in real estate, for example, they're looking for other opportunities to put money to work. And so that's an opportunity for both large global conglomerates to raise capital or rethink their balance sheet. It's also an opportunity for startup companies to tap into a market and seek to raise capital, because we're seeing a lot of funders who just don't know where to put money to work in good deals. And for solid brands that have a good mind share, market share, there's opportunity out there to tap in and grow your business by raising capital if that's something that's on the table for you to do. And so I see that as a silver lining, because it's creating an opportunity for companies to think about their future and to think about growth.
Absolutely. Anyone else have one?
I think, I think e-commerce is a good, I think we were headed there, right? But I think for all food and beverage, e-commerce wasn't quite there yet. And, mostly people are buying, electronics and clothing and things on e-commerce on a regular basis, or consumer staples that aren't food and beverage. But I think as the pandemic hit, and now retailers, are getting better at, picking up, ordering online and picking up, I think that's an area of opportunity, especially for smaller companies who may not have, their own distribution center or their own network of distributors. They may be able to leverage that not only to engage with the consumer directly, rather than just having to go through the retailer and convince the retailer to shelve your product. They can connect with the actual consumer. So I think that may open up some opportunities, not only for the consumer, but I think it's going to open up opportunities maybe for companies as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Dennis, how about you?
Well, as much as COVID has been basically a hellscape for, kind of the non-retail channel for food service, it's been nightmarish. There's no doubt, such disruption. But frankly, in retail, we've just seen such a focus on eating at home and everything else. It's been a very good time to be in the food and beverage business. It's really put some wind in our sails. And I think just taking that, using that, that kind of momentum just to build on and try to establish more things for the future, I think that's the silver lining for many, many food and beverage companies right now.
Couldn't agree more. Erin, how about you?
I think that this time has, you know, in a way, sort of forced the hand of a lot of companies to really be creative and really innovate. And, you know, like Dennis said, there is a captive audience here amongst consumers. I think they are willing to try a lot of new products at home. So I think that there is a lot of value in innovating your products right now. And, you know, we've seen just an explosion in things like plant-based products, and consumers are very willing to try those. So, you know, with all of the time and energy being spent in that innovation, equal amount of energy and attention should be spent on protecting that for the long run in your IP.
Terrific. Makes perfect sense. And at the risk of answering my own question, and building a little bit on Dennis, the food and beverage industry, while there's many aspects of it that are certainly hurting, food service and restaurants are certainly hurting, but I do think large portions of the food and beverage industry continue to do incredibly well, and seeing some incredible growth. And hopefully they can hold on to that growth even as things sort of evolve and change. And wow, we've really seen, and I think the investment community is recognizing this as well, that people still eat. Like many things have changed, but people are still eating. They still nourish themselves, and food and beverage is really a pretty good investment over the long haul. And especially I think the awareness of companies sort of digging in and really making sure they've taken care of their employees, and recognizing just the importance of those employees. And again, I think food and beverage has been sort of at the forefront of that, which is super exciting. Okay. Now, are there downsides? Are we going to see fewer startups? Are we going to see big brands take over? Like what are some of the things that may not be so great coming back out of COVID? Anybody who wants to jump in, I welcome you.
I can jump in. I think just generally, you know, as it's sort of a negative of COVID is the economic situation. And I think, especially if you're a global brand, I think you have to worry about infringements and counterfeits of your IP. And so I think you have to be even more vigilant during this time, because I think, you know, anytime you have a down economy, people are looking to borrow, so to speak, what you've already done. And so, you know, there may be situations where people are, you know, getting too close to your brand by infringing it, or in some countries, I don't think it's a huge problem in the US, although it does happen, you know, actually counterfeiting your product, passing their product off as your product. So I think that's something that everybody needs to pay attention to and be mindful of, and you know, make sure you have your enforcement strategy, because you don't want consumers eating a counterfeit product thinking it's yours.
Such a good point. Thank you for raising that. Erin.
Dovetailing on what Sabrina said, the flip side of that as an emerging brand is to have a strategy in place for doing your due diligence before you bring a product on the market. Big brands, IP holders are going to be on high alert in these times, and they're going to have a hold on what their IP is and maybe looking to enforce it. So make sure before you, you know, settle on a brand name, before you settle on a style of packaging or on a product, that you have taken a look at what's out there. You can do a really simple search on the United States Patent and Trademark Office website for any trademark registrations that are already locked up by other companies. You can even run Google patent searches if you think that you're maybe using a technology that is patented. So have, you know, take the steps to make sure that you're not going to be running afoul of anyone else's IP before you launch a new product.
Makes perfect sense. Ryan or Dennis, anything to add?
I think about this question more in a sort of a proactive sense, as how to avoid a downside scenario. And so I really think it just comes back to being proactive about protecting the things that need to be protected, whether it's against counterfeits or IP or patent infringement. and also thinking about how you might be able to leverage these assets for not getting into a situation where your company or your balance sheet is distressed, and then you have to offload or leverage assets that you never intended to have to get rid of. And so I think about, how can you prevent that from happening? I think it is important to think ahead about your IP portfolio and how you can do it to lock it up. The other point is, if you are an emerging brand and you're thinking about an exit strategy down the road, whether that's next year or in the future, thinking about your IP in the sense of, how do I not encumber the asset such that it would preclude me from maximizing value in a transaction down the road? And so there's a lot of strategies that could be deployed to make sure that that's the case, by whether that's an effective licensing strategy or co-branding strategy. It's something to keep top of mind as you think about what's going to come next, particularly those companies anticipating an exit down the road or in the near term.
Terrific. Thank you. And Dennis, what's there?
Well, Sabrina, Aaron, and Ryan have all given incredibly strategic and smart answers. I'll give a very simple one, and it's just about, look, and the biggest downside is the economic downturn, and the simple fact we've got food insecurity at unprecedented levels in the United States. We've got a global economic downturn. These are scary things. Fortunately, our price points are lower, but still, this is probably the biggest meta challenge I see right now in the industry, because in the near term, and frankly, with our price points, I think we're largely insulated from that. But overall, consumer spending is a very serious, is under incredible strain at the moment.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So let's take a moment and just encourage our attendees to type your questions into the chat or Q&A feature. We will answer those in just a second. So really want to hear from you all on what's on your mind. In the meantime, I'd love to kind of get parting thoughts or sort of any kind of final wisdom or anything you'd like to add to the conversation as we go through. Sabrina, let's start with you on that.
I think it's just what we've all discussed before is, as you look at all these things that are happening, the economy, COVID, really sit down and think about where you want your brand to go, what message you want to communicate, and then, talk to someone and figure out how can you use IP to help you get there and help protect what you're building once you do get there.
Terrific. Dennis?
I just say that I think the new frontier for IP when it comes to food and beverage brands isn't what you make, it's how you make it, how you source it. Some of these supply chain issues, I think, have become really a new place to get specific, ownable, differentiating product attributes and IP that builds long-term consumer loyalty.
Terrific. Ryan, parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think Dennis makes a great point, and I think the big point I would convey is is not to stress. There are options available to companies large and small to leverage their IP portfolio for a multitude of channels, whether that's a transaction channel, a financial channel, a protective channel around keeping your IP and products safe across the world. I think it requires a sound IP strategy, a lot of forward thinking, but whether a company is distressed or in a healthy condition and thinking about how they can leverage the current market climate to enhance their business, I think there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of options available to companies, and I would just encourage people to not to stress about the current COVID environment. There are ways to leverage the IP portfolio to solve problems in this environment.
Terrific, thank you. And Aaron?
Yeah, just sort of coming full circle with a lot of the points that we've all talked about. I would encourage anyone out there listening to not think about IP as sort of a static point in time. There's not a single IP strategy that's going to work across the lifetime of your business. And there's going to be different things you'll be able to do and achieve with your IP over the lifetime of your business. So, continually reevaluate where you are, what you're innovating, how you've changed your brand, if you've launched new products. think about IP in all of those situations. If you do have, like Ryan said, potentially have an exit strategy on the horizon, think about IP and, you know, evaluate it as you go along.
Terrific, great advice. So again, want to encourage questions from our attendees, and I have a question while we're waiting for some to come through. With the, I'll say, emphasis and sort of shift to more retail and seeing so much happening at retail, and I'll say, and shoppers shopping a different way. No one is dwelling in a grocery store at the moment. It's almost like a race to see just how quickly you can get in and out. Things like trade dress take on significant importance because they need to find your brand quickly. Any thoughts on sort of the importance of trade dress and how best to protect that in a time like now when it's so incredibly important?
Sure. You know, like you said, Alan, the look and feel of your product can be really valuable in means for consumers to identify you on the store shelf or identify your brand as they're scrolling through Instagram. So there are many ways, depending on sort of what aspect of your you know, product, whether it be the packaging, whether it be the shape of your product itself. You know, the shape of a Coke bottle is a trade dress that they have protected. So if there is a particular aspect like that, there are design patents that you can actually use to secure a functional aspect of the design of your product, if that's actually you know, something that you've put into it. I absolutely agree that that sort of visual trigger for consumers is really important.
And I think too, you know, if you're a smaller brand, don't be afraid to seek legal advice if you think, you know, retailers are private label is getting too close to your trade dress. I do think, you know, some people worry about that. And they are given maybe a little bit more protection under the law, but it's still possible. And usually, you know, a discussion with the retailer will often you know, result in some changes to help differentiate their branded products from your branded products.
Thank you, Dennis.
I think this just goes back to that notion of familiar brands. You know, this happened way pre-pandemic, but we remember when Tropicana changed their package and they lost 20% of sales because people no longer saw the straw and orange. The idea of quick, kind of telegraphic kind of moments that grab your attention, particularly now when we're in hunt, we're not really in gathering mode, we're in hunt mode when we go to a grocery store. Get it, go. Well, given that, it makes sense that brands that have invested in their brands over time, that products that are very familiar will rise to the fore because we're not spending as much time looking at all the different elderberry jams you might be able to buy. We're just grabbing the one we recognize and getting out of there. So I think it's more important than ever, but I also think for new brands, that's why a differentiated package, a differentiated story can really be their way of trying to level the playing field.
Terrific. Sabrina, you brought up private label, which I think is such an important issue. And especially as we may be looking at an economic downturn, and I'll say maybe even some emboldened retailers with sort of a resurgence in their business. What are your thoughts on sort of how do you protect yourself? It's always a challenge, especially for smaller companies, when private label can be so aggressive and turn things around just so quickly. And again, I would anticipate our boldened retailers, that may be a big deal for them.
Yeah, I think first of all, you look at how do I protect my trade dress so that when I do have to enforce it, I have a little bit more ability to do so. And I attended years ago a trademark conference, and an attorney for one of the a mass market retailer basically said the first thing they do when they're clearing product packaging is look to see what's registered. And typically you don't think of registering trade dress a lot of times, you know, and so that sort of sent a light bulb in my head. Well, maybe that's a reason you should consider to register, because if you come up with new packaging and you think this might be something that retailers or private label will want to eventually get close to or copy, depending on what side of the table you're on, then maybe you should spend a little bit of money to register it, because it might prevent them from actually taking that step.
Great advice. Great advice. Any final comments as we're just hitting noon? All right, I will let that be the last comment. I will thank you all for your just terrific conversation today. Great insights. Just again, a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Really want to thank everyone for just really terrific engagement, and want to thank McDonald Hopkins for just terrific sponsoring of today's event and bringing forward this incredibly important issue. Thank you all.